It's a large book. It's about 700 or 800 pages, but it definitely rewards a first and even a second reading. Time doesn't allow me to obviously go into the details. He does the 48 War, 56 War, 67 War, 73 War, Lebanon War, First Intifada, Second Intifada. It's quite exhaustive. And what I'll do, instead of going through that record, let me read you his conclusions. Very briefly, I think you'll be surprised. Says the former head of the Jaffe Center for Strategic Studies at Tel Aviv University, he says, Israel's war experience is a story of folly, recklessness, and self-made traps. None, N-O-N-E, none of Israel's wars, with a possible exception of the 1948 War of Independence, none was a war of necessity. They were all wars of choice or folly. Israel's decision-makers were as reluctant and risk-averse when it came to making peace as they were daring and trigger-happy when it came to making war. The official Israeli decision-makers typically did not initiate peace overtures. Most of the peace initiatives in the Arab-Israeli conflict came either from the Arabs, from the international community, or informal channels. When Israel was willing to make risks for peace, these usually paid off. The Arabs generally showed a remarkable tendency for compliance with their treaty obligations. In quite a few cases, it was Israel, rather than the Arabs, that violated formal and informal agreements. And during questions and answers, I would be happy to go through that history, which I know fairly well, and which I think he accurately renders, though I must myself express surprise that even in the case of the 1948 war, he calls it only a possible exception to the rule that all of Israel's wars were wars of choice. Now, bear in mind, under international law, a war of choice means a war of aggression, because under international law, you're only allowed to use armed force if armed force has been used against you, Article 51 of the UN Charter. So, in effect, what Ma'oz is saying is all of Israel's wars were wars of aggression. Well, that's the past. What about the present? The present basically means the human rights record. What's going on in the occupied territories? And if you look at typical media coverage, I was very struck by it during Israel's recent invasion of Gaza. What typically happens, if I had the papers in front of me, I would read them to you. You have the New York Times' correspondent in Gaza, Ms. Kirshner, and Kirshner will say something like, or she literally did say, that the Palestinians say most of the casualties were civilians. Israel, however, says most of the casualties were combatants. And then you're left to throw your hands in the air in despair. Who's telling the truth? Who knows what happened? But of course, in any other conflict in the world, we don't have those questions asked by reporters, because what they do is they typically go to the local human rights organization or representative of a larger human rights organization or reputable human rights observers and asks them, what happened? What are the numbers? So just as Ms. Kirshner was reporting what the Palestinians said and what the Israelis said, B'Tselem, the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in the Occupied Territories, it put out a press release, and it said that the majority of those killed during Israel's recent assault on Gaza, the majority were civilians. And that's what I want to look at briefly, namely, in order to examine the human rights record in the occupied territories, the obvious place to go is the numerous human rights organizations which monitor what's going on there. As it happens, Israel-Palestine is probably the most heavily monitored area in the world by human rights organizations. There are the big organizations, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and then a whole slew of local organizations which seem to multiply like mushrooms after a rain. There is the best known being B'Tselem, the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in the Occupied Territories, but then there's Physicians for Human Rights, there's the Public Committee Against Torture in Israel, there's Gisha, there's a huge number. And it's a very interesting fact, because you have all of these organizations. They all have their own independent staffs, research staffs, legal staffs, field staffs. And a lot of human rights law is still very nebulous. That means it's a little bit fuzzy, because human rights law is the most recent body, it's a very recent body of international law. And so a lot of the terms haven't been fully defined. You often hear the term human shield. How many people have heard human shield? What that exactly means under international law is not entirely clear. When you try to investigate what they mean by that expression, it's not entirely obvious. So, for example, if you're in a city and you place a piece of an anti-aircraft apparatus, what would you call anti-aircraft guns? Okay, anti-aircraft guns next to a apartment dwelling. Is that using the apartment dwelling as a human shield or not? It's not really clear, because if you're in a city, everywhere there are people. So the terms aren't fully clear what they exactly mean. And then a lot of human rights work consists of people going out and just observing. And as we all know, human beings are susceptible, vulnerable to error. So, for example, human rights observers go out to a clash in Hebron, and they have to look on the Palestinian side. Did they initiate the hostilities? And if they did they use live ammunition? And if they used live ammunition, were they amid the crowd or in the periphery of the crowd? And if the Israeli soldiers initiated a clash, were they in a life-threatening position? Did they fire warning shots? Did they aim at the legs? Did they aim at the torso? Did they aim at the head? Those are all, considerations when you try to discuss the legality of what happened. And obviously there's a lot of room for human error. People see the same thing and they see it differently. What's really remarkable when you come to the Israel-Palestine conflict is, notwithstanding so many different organizations and the nebulousness of the law and the vulnerability to human error, it's quite remarkable how little disagreement there is about what's happening there. For a book I wrote a couple of years ago, I sat down, I read through about 20 years of human rights reports. And that was a lot. It was in the many, many thousands of pages, because these human rights reports proliferate at a very rapid rate. And what struck me in reading through all of these reports from a 2-decade period is that literally, this is not hyperbole, that's the fancy word for exaggeration, literally, I was only able to find one case of one demonstration, one